All right. So today what we're going to do, we will continue from where we dropped off in the last class. So in the last class, we started discussing for loops, right? So we will continue to discuss for loops from there, from that point. We will discuss for loops with the else statements, right? We will also discuss for loops with the break and continue statements, right? And we will go on from there. All right. Okay, so let me just bring this guy again. What are loops? Like we discussed in the in the last class, was something like, if you have a piece of code, you want to run it over and over again for like n number of times, right? Or you can have an infinite loop as well, and then you can decide when to break the loop, and so on and so forth. So you use loops, right? So for loops are similar to while loops. So whatever you can do with for loops, you can also do with while loops. But what is the difference? The main difference is like their syntax, and also many times for loops tend to give you more compact written code, right? For instance, let's say if I want to run a loop for 10 times, I can do something like for m in range 10, right? So automatically it will go from 0 till 9, and then I can say print m, right? So if I just do that, and you can see it's going to start to try to connect to the Google server, and then it's going to run it. Hopefully soon it's connecting. I think it's connected. And no, yeah, so I did not put the parentheses in for the print thing, so it should be fine now. Yeah, so you can see by default it goes, when you say range 10, by default starts with 0 and goes until 10. If I want, let's say, going from 1 till 10, I can do something like this. So you can see it goes from 1 until 10, just skipping the last one, right? I can also decide to, if I want to hop, let's say 2 units, going from 1, 3, 5, 9, and 5, 7, 9, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now the interesting thing about the for loops in Python is that you can use that directly with lists without needing to have a loop control variable that iterates over the members of the list, right? For instance, if I have a list which says list A equals, let's say I have just characters A, B, C, and I have D, right? So I can just say for m in list A, print m. So when I do that, it will just loop over all the entries inside the list, right? And then for each iteration, it will assume the value of the consecutive member of the list, right? And then it will just print that out, and it will exit. Right? Questions to this point? All good? Okay. Now we can also have for loops with else statements, and the else statement is printed, or else statement is executed, or the statements in the else block are executed when all the options in the for loop are exhausted. Like for example, if I say print I am in the else block, right? So if I run this, so you see, first it went through this loop, right? So when it entered this loop, it just iterated over all the members of the list, and then when it ended, it just printed this statement because this was in the else block. Clear? Yeah. Okay. Now you can also have nested for loops as well, right? Like for example, let's say if I have a list of car models, right? So let's say list car, right, or car mix, and let's say I have, for instance, I have Toyota, I have, I don't know, Ford, right? I have BMW, right? I have Mercedes, right? So let's say I have these 4 car makes, right? And let's say I have colors, and the colors are say yellow, and I have another color which is red, right? And then I have, let's say, white, right? Then I have, let's say, black, right? So what we are doing is, since you arrived a bit late, what we're doing is like we're trying to understand what a nested for loop. So similar to nested while loops, you have loops within the other loops, right? So for instance, here I can have for, I say, car make in list underscore car, right? And I say print car make is car underscore make, right? And then I say print now selecting color, and then I say for color in list underscore colors, and then I just remove this, right? I say print the car make is, let's say, car underscore make, then I say of color, and then I say color, right? And then I say, let me just go to this one, so print I am out of the inner loop, and then I say here I am out of the nested for loop. Right now, if you just go over the code, it will initialize a list named list underscore car, and it has these different car makes. Then you have the colors, so these are the different colors, and then it will say for car make and list underscore car. So that means, in the first iteration, the car make is going to be what? It's going to be Toyota, right? So it will start with the car make value Toyota, and then it's going to print the car make value, and then it will print this statement, and then it will enter in this loop. And once it enters in this loop, it will go over all the values inside the list underscore colors, right? Yes. Here, right? Because the thing is, this whole thing is inside this for loop, right? So this block is inside this for loop. So for the first complete iteration of this block, the car make will remain Toyota, right? Only in the next iteration, the car make will become Ford, and then so on and so forth. Does that make sense? Clear? All right. So if I run this, and you can see it starts with car make is Toyota. So now selecting color. The car make is Toyota of color red, right? Then the car make is Toyota of color white. So you can see the car make stays the same, but this inner loop is being executed, right? So it goes over all the values of the colors, right? And then it prints I am out of the inner loop, so it's going to print this guy, right? And then it will move to the beginning of the loop, right? Because there are some values left in there. So the next iteration, car make will become Ford, and then this whole block will be executed again for the Ford, right? And then this will go on. Clear? Questions to this point? Yes.
The label that you put before, the car underscore make and color,
Mm-hmm.
this is only relevant to the for loop. If you put it outside the loop, it will not be.
Mm-hmm. So let's say we try to print car underscore make outside the loop. So it's going to print the last value that the for loop has assumed, right? For example, in the very end, the car make is Mercedes. So when I say print car make, so the variable is still defined, right, outside the loop as well, right? So it will just have the value which would be the last value inside the loop. Does that make sense? Yes.
So what data type is this? Or just like car make?
Sorry.
Car underscore make.
Yeah, it's a string data type, right? Why? Because all these are strings, and you can also, if you want to print as, right? So you say print type car underscore make. You say this is string data type, right? And on the contrary, like if let's say car make is an integer, right? So let's say 100. Yeah. So for that particular iteration, it's this guy, right? For all the other iterations, it's a string. So it just assumes the value that is inside the list. Is this clear?
So if you
Yeah.
say it's right here to the array,
Sorry.
let's just say the car make was in another array in that list. So it's to the array, and then there's car in that.
You mean why would you want these nested loops?
No, no, I'm just
Yeah.
saying
Okay.
the data type of, let's just say Ford was in another array. So you
Ah.
have the array.
Okay. If this was another array, right? Like for example, this was a list of lists, right? So then the type was going to be another list. Right. Any other questions? All good? Yeah. Okay. So we discussed nested for loops. We discussed for loops with else statements, right? We discussed the basic syntax of for loops, right? And compared to while loops, many times they would lead to a more compact list of statements, right? For example, for while loop, maybe if you need 3 statements, and for loop you can do it with 2 statements or something like that. And whatever you can do with for loops, you can also do with while loops. Whatever you can do with while loops, you can also do with for loops, right? Okay, so let's see break and continue statements for loops. So like we discussed for while loops, break statements are used to get out of the loop or terminate the loop prematurely, right? And whenever you are going to encounter a break statement, it's going to just break the innermost loop. Okay, and similar story is for continue. However, for continue, what happens whenever you are going to encounter continue, it will just skip the rest of the statements inside the loop, right? And it will continue with the beginning of the loop. For instance, let's say you say that if color is equal to yellow, so it will check if the color is yellow, right? Color of the car is yellow, and it's going to just break the loop if that happens. So you have this for loop starting from here. It will go over all the values of car make, right? Well, in the first iteration, it will have the value Toyota, right? And then it will reach here, and it will go all the values for all the values of color, right? And when it will encounter yellow, it's going to just break this loop. It's going to just break the innermost loop. So the control will just skip this statement, and then it will move on to here because the inner loop is broken. So it will just move on to this guy, right? And then it will go to the beginning of the loop, and this process will continue, right? Let me just run this, and you can see here, and let me just remove this type. This car make is Toyota. Now selecting the color, the car make is Toyota of color red, the car make is Toyota of color white, and then it says I'm out of the inner loop. Why? Because when encountered yellow, it just broke the loop. Does that make sense? Yeah. On the contrary, if you have in place of break, you can also have, let's say, continue. And for continue, what will happen? As soon as it's going to encounter this continue, it will just move the control of execution to the beginning of the loop, beginning of whichever loop it is in. right? So then it's going to just skip this line of code. In the break, it will just get out of the innermost loop. In continue, it will just move it to the beginning of the of whatever loop you are in. Okay, so if I just run this, see the car makes Toyota, not selecting color. The car makes Toyota of color red. The car makes Toyota of color white. But then it encountered yellow, because after white you have yellow. So then it just continued to the beginning of the loop, and then it says the car make is Toyota of color black. Is this clear? Yes.
So continue is more like a, sorry, break is more like a full stop. It says like stop after this one.
Exactly.
While the continue just skipping the condition and going on.
So continue, like no matter how many statements you have after this, right? For example, you have here a statement which says 20 times, let's say, you have this dash. Right, so you have another statement which says I am still in the inner loop, right? And then I have get me out, right? All right, so let's say I have this statement up here. So if I run this, for this continue, these set of statements will not be printed when the color is yellow, right? So you see, or maybe I can just print another statement here, print encountered yellow. If I run this, you see it starts here, car make is Toyota, now selecting the color. The car make is Toyota of color red. I'm still in the inner loop, get me out. The car make is Toyota of color white, because the second one is white, right? And then I'm still in the inner loop, get me out. Encountered yellow, right? So now what happened when it's encountered yellow, it just moved to the beginning of the loop, right? And it started continuing again, right? And then from there, it's then for the next iteration, the car make was still Toyota, but color was black. So for that reason, this set of statements were executed, and then you got out of the inner loop, and then you went to the beginning of the first loop, and this one, and then it continued execution from there. However, if I had a break statement here, it will just terminate the inner loop as soon as it would encounter this one. So for example, here it just did for it printed for red, right? It printed for white, right? And then it encountered yellow. So as soon as it encountered yellow, it moved out of the innermost loop, which was essentially these statements, and then it printed this statement which says this one, I am outside of the inner loop, right? And then it moved to the beginning of this loop and then continued execution from there. Clear? So what we discussed so far, we discussed the basic syntax of a for loop. And again, what are loops? Loops are statements in Python that we, or in any programming language, that we use to execute a certain block of code over and over again. How many times do we need to execute it? It depends on the situation, right? And we understood the basic syntax of a for loop, right? And we, we discussed like nested for loops, we discussed for loops with else statements, we discussed for loops with break statements and continue statements. All good? Yeah, okay. So then let's